Today I'm going to be installing an auxiliary light on my Ariens Snow Blower. Now there's a couple of things I want to get out of the way before I get too far along in the video. The first is that I am not a professional small engine mechanic. So if you're going to attempt this project yourself, make sure that you get help from a professional before you do. I'm just offering this video up for entertainment purposes only. The second thing I'll mention is that I'm going to leave links to the parts that I'm using down in the description below, but you don't have to use these exact parts. In fact, they may not even work on your snowblower. So again, make sure you do some research and talk to a professional before you attempt something like this on your own machine. Now that that's out of the way, let's get started with the job. In order to power my new light, I need an AC to DC converter to convert the 12 volt AC that is coming off of the snowblower's engine to 12 volts DC, which is required by the light. And this converter that I found on Amazon should work for my application. Again, there's a link down in the description if you want to learn more, but the label on this one shows that it accepts between 10 volts and 28 volts AC and converts that to 12 volts DC with a max output of 3 amps. According to the specifications for my light, it will draw about 18 watts. Now, I decided I wanted a converter that could supply at least double that amount of power, so that's why I decided to go with this one, because it is capable of providing 36 watts. And speaking of the light, here's the one I found on Amazon that I think is going to work for my application. And again, there's a link down in the description if you want to see the details on this light. But we'll take a quick look at the specs here anyway. The lighting element is 10 inches long. The light can run on DC voltage anywhere between 10 and 30, and it is IP67 rated, so it should be able to handle snow and snowmelt that might get kicked up while I'm snow blowing. And the main body of this light is die-cast metal. And what that means is it should hold up in the cold and not crack like a unit with a plastic body might. The first thing I want to do is install the AC-DC converter. Now, what I want to do is find a convenient point to tap into the 12 volt AC line that comes off of the engine. I think the best spot to tap into that line is here underneath the control panel. The wiring goes up under here already anyway to power the headlight and the heated hand grips. Also, if I keep everything under here, it sort of keeps this out of the weather a little bit. It's obviously not completely environmentally sealed, but should be better than just being out in the open. Here's a look at all the wiring that's up under the control panel. Now I've already cut all the zip ties that were holding it up in here neatly so that we can get a look at what's going on. This side of the wire is the side that goes back down towards the engine. You can see it comes up here and then starts to split off to the headlight and the heated hand grips. The black connector here and the subsequent pigtail on this side of it going up underneath the control panel is what goes directly to the factory headlight. Now I'm going to keep that factory headlight, so what I think I'll do is splice into the wiring here and connect up my converter to this side of the pigtail. The other reason I think I want to splice in here is because if for some reason I screw this up or want to put it back to factory default, I can just buy a new pigtail, plug it back in, and it'll be back the way that it was. Before I cut any wiring, I want to find a convenient spot to mount the converter. I want to try and locate this somewhere under here so that the wires will reach where I want to splice in. Now if we look at the label, this is a little bit counterintuitive compared to what we're seeing on the snowblower. The red wires in this case are the ones that are going to need to connect up to the yellow and black wires on the snowblower, and the yellow and black wires coming out of the converter are the ones that are going to connect up to my new headlight. So after looking this over, I think right here is going to be the best spot to mount this. The input wires should be within reach of the input wires over here, and then the output wires should be within reach of where I want to run the headlight wires. Now this piece right here on the back of the control panel is metal, and there's just 2 screws here that hold on sort of a plastic vanity plate. Now there's room between this bracket and the plastic vanity plate, so I should be able to put some hardware in here to bolt this up after I drill a couple of holes in the metal. So just to make things easier and just so I don't damage the vanity plate, I'm going to use that 8mm socket and just remove these screws and get it out of the way. Just to make things a little easier, I've come to the front side of that bracket. Once I get that roughly where I want, I'll use a marker to trace out the location of the ears. To help keep my holes centered when I drill them, I'm going to use a punch located on the mark I made and just tap it a few times with a hammer. So I'm going to first drill a small hole as a pilot hole. And then I'll open up the hole so it's a little bit bigger than the fastener I plan to use. So I've got a few burrs in the metal from drilling the holes, so I'm just going to use a flat file and file those down. As you can see, I've got the converter in place with the screws through the ears on this side. On the opposite side of the bracket is where I'll put the flat washers and the nuts. Now I don't have quite enough length on these screws to use a lock nut, so I'm going to put a dab of blue thread locker on here to just help prevent this thing from loosening up over time. So now I'll tighten these up. I'll use my Phillips screwdriver on the back on the head of the screw, and then I'll bring my socket in and tighten this up. The next thing I want to do is strip back the ends of the wires on the converter a little bit more. Now while I'm here, I'll do the same for the black and yellow wires. Now that I've got those stripped back, I'm going to cut the wire that goes to the headlight on the headlight side of the connector, about halfway between the connector body and where the wrapping starts. Now I'll strip back the insulation on the headlight wires that I just cut. So next, I'll take one of the red wires from the converter and I will sort of twist it a little bit together with the yellow wire going to the headlight. And then I'll bring in my male barrel connector and kind of get that seated on the wire. Now it's not going to be real visible in the camera, but there's sort of a little window in the barrel connector. Once I get the bare copper wires visible in that window, I should have enough in there to crimp it. And we should be good to go. Now that that's done, I'll do the same thing with the other red wire and the black wire that goes to the headlight. Before I crimp the female connectors onto the connector side of this wire, I'm going to cut a couple of pieces of shrink tubing and slip it over the wires. So now I'll grab female barrel connectors and crimp one on the black wire and one on the yellow wire that goes off to the engine side. So now I'll bring in some heat shrink tubing on the male sides of the connector, making sure that the tubing is pushed far enough back where it won't interfere with the mating of the connectors. Now I'll connect these up. Because this is AC, I don't think it strictly matters, but I am going to keep the yellow wire with the yellow wire and the black with the black. Now when I bring in my heat gun, it's actually going to shrink the outer body of the female connector around the male, and of course we'll shrink up this tubing as well, and it should seal up this connection fairly well. So next I'm going to work on figuring out how to mount the headlight. Now they did come with a couple of mounting brackets, and these are just attached to the side of the headlight with a socket head screw. I used the supplied Allen wrench to just snug these up. Now I'll get them positioned on the bottom of the headlight so they're roughly parallel to its body. Now if I bring in a tape measure, I can see that the span between the holes is 10 inches. I'll keep that in mind for the next step. So as far as placement goes, I think the best place for this particular light bar is right here on top of the control panel, just in front of the speed control. The brackets on the bottom of the headlight lift it up so it just about clears these bolt heads that are here. And it looks like there are flat spots in the metal, so I should be able to drill holes to mount hardware to. So I'm going to bring in my hammer and punch and get a spot close to the corner here. Okay, move the drive lever out of the way, and now I'll drill a pilot hole at the spot that I punched. And now I'll open up this hole so it's big enough to accept the mounting hardware that came with the headlight kit. Now just like before, we've got a few burrs on both sides of the hole because there's a sticker sort of on top, but we'll clean those up with a file. Now I'll measure over 10 inches from the site of my first hole. Once again, we'll punch and drill. Now that the holes are drilled, I'm going to remove these brackets from the light. Before I drop the hardware in place, I'm going to put just a little bit of blue thread locker on the threads of the bolt, and this should help prevent the nuts from loosening up over time. Now I can mount the brackets to the snowblower. I'm going to use the bolts that were supplied with the kit, drop those through the holes along with the bracket. So on the underside, I will first install the flat washer and then thread the nut in place. And then I will of course do the same thing for the other bolt. So just to make sure everything fits, before I tighten up these nuts and bolts, I'm going to bring the headlight back in and get it installed on the brackets. So I'll bring my socket head screws back in and tighten those up with the supplied Allen wrench. Now that that's all in place, I can go under here with my 10mm socket and just tighten up these nuts. So just like I did with the wires on the converter, I'm going to strip back the wires on the headlight pigtail just a little bit more. So now I'm going to run the wires down through this gap in the sheet metal here next to the speed control notches. If I run it like that, the wires shouldn't be in the way when the speed control is actuated and won't get pinched. I had to cut back some of this outer insulation on the headlight wire so that there was enough of the inner wire sticking out for my barrel connector to fit. But now I've got that kind of slid up in place and I can crimp that on. One thing you may have already noticed is that I'm using a smaller barrel connector on this wire, and that's because it's a thinner gauge than what we were working with on the other side. The other thing to mention is that these connectors have sort of a shrinkable sleeve, so I don't really need the heat shrink tubing since I can heat these up and they'll conform to the wire as is. Now I'll get the female connectors attached to the wires coming from the converter. So now I can connect these up, and I do want to make sure that I connect the black wire to the black and the yellow to the red. Now that all the connections are made, I'm going to get the wires all kind of bundled back up and tied up in place here underneath the control panel. And when I do that, I'm going to make sure that they're out of the way of the speed control so they don't get pinched when that's actuated. I can reinstall this vanity panel. Put the screws in from the back and we should be good to try this thing out. So I think the wires are all tied up and out of the way. Everything looks good. Let's give this thing a try. Before we try out the light, let me know down in the comments if this is something that you would try on your machine. And if it is something that you're going to try, would you do it the same way I'm doing it, or would you do something different? Now it's not quite dark out yet, but we should get a pretty good idea of how bright this thing is. I do have the exposure on the camera cranked up a little bit right now so you can see me. I'm going to put it back down to 0. We'll fire up the machine and see what things look like. I didn't think to get any footage of this before I put the new headlight on so you could see what it looked like with just the stock light. But nevertheless, it's fully dark out now. Let's see how much light we get out of this new one. Unfortunately, my camera's not doing a good job of showing the full extent of how well this light is actually lighting up my driveway. Now, from where I'm standing, sort of to the edge of vision here in this shot, is about 50 or 60 feet. But the field of the light is actually extending a little bit past that and also sort of out to the sides. And I think this will make snow blowing in the dark a much better experience than it was with just using the factory light on this machine.